Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Library Company of Philadelphia. My name is Fran Dolan. I am the Director of Operations for the Library Company, and I'm excited to have all of you joining us this evening for tonight's Fireside Chat. William James, American Influencer, History Challenges Models with Dr. Paul Croce. Immediately following the presentation this evening, there will be a Q&A. You can use the Q&A feature on the Zoom to submit any questions that you would like to hear Dr. Croce answer. The Library Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin, is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. Free and open to the public, the Library Company houses an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photograph, and works of art. Our mission is to foster scholarship in and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our care. To that end, we host a wide range of free public programming, which is what brings us all here this evening. And as always, I'd like to acknowledge our members and shareholders whose support makes these events possible. Shareholding at the Library Company is a unique opportunity to own a piece of the library's history and to be a steward of its future. You could check out our website if you're interested in learning more about shareholding, including the benefits and access to member-only events and all sorts of wonderful opportunities that go along with that. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Paul Croce. Dr. Croce has spent over 3 decades researching and teaching American cultural and intellectual history as professor of history at Stetson University. He recently retired to get to work in new and related work in public scholarship. He is continuing his academic research on the life and work of William James, the founder of American psychology and pragmatism. He's the author of Young William James Thinking, Hopkins University Press, 2017, and Science and Religion in the Era of William James, University of North Carolina Press, 1995. And his recent works include Science and Religion in America, Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion, 2018, Learning from People Who Disagree, the 2020 History of Psychology Wallace A. Russell Memorial Lecture at the American Psychological Association, and the chapter on James and Medicine for the Oxford Handbook of William James, forthcoming in 2024. In addition, he has been president of the William James Society. His public scholarship in the spirit of James's own public outreach and his dozens of articles for newspapers and magazines on contemporary issues in politics and culture have been published widely, including at the Huffington Post, and they serve as a kind of public classroom. In fact, that is the name of Dr. Croce's webpage, the Public Classroom. You could see his opening essay, Dreaming in Translation. Dr. Croce, welcome to Fireside Chat. We're excited to have you this evening.
Thanks so much, Fran, and thanks to the Library Company for hosting this and hosting so many good talks. Now that you've seen me, I'm going to show you a blurb about what I'm presenting here. So you heard a little bit from Fran about William James, that he's well known as a founder of American psychology. He was an early philosopher of pragmatism. He's one of the first also to develop personal and spiritual approaches to religion. And from this, let's see. There we go. So tonight, I welcome you to an hour with William James, and also with ways of understanding James, and ways of understanding ways that he suggests ways to address social challenges. And I thought to ask any of you who care to speak on what brings you here. Is it an interest in James? Is it an interest in finding out how this guy became so quotable on Hallmark cards and things like that? Or would you like to glean some tips about social challenges and ways to deal with them? What brings you here? Is there anyone that has a voice to share? I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. If there aren't any immediate thoughts, I can supply what brings me here. I offer pre-political leavens toward improvements in society. And I find him a good guide on those challenges. These are challenges that have haunted American politics, and his psychological and spiritual accounts of the human condition provide just these kind of political leavens. And when I say leavens, I'm literally thinking the way you would with bread, a rising. Are there ways in which his ideas can bring a healthier rising in society? When I first read James, I wondered, how did he reach his achievements? How did James become James? How did James become the James of fame? How did a confused young man become insightful and influential? How? In short, by turning his problems into opportunities. Young James was confused about the truths of so many competing outlooks and about multiple choices for his own personal and vocational paths in life. Uncertainty about multiple views would become opportunities to understand experience more thoroughly. He applied that insight throughout his work, using his learning about contrasting perspectives to develop alternatives. Throughout, he drew on his personal and temperamental resources and his wide reading, what we would call interdisciplinary in our day, what he just called undisciplined. And he developed another resource, his work on the border between intellectual production and popular expression. And that work, in what I call the social media of his time, is a culminating focus for my time tonight. So in sum, I'm now presenting first on James's personal history when he was awash in uncertainties, until he decided to embrace them as guides to deeper understanding. Second, on the way his youthful resolutions about uncertainty would shape his mature theories. And third, on his application of these insights to social problems in his own time. Then I'll wrap up with a few tips from James about ways to turn from sharply contrasting views in our time to turn them from obstacles even into opportunities. Spoiler alert, the theme I draw from my research on James, related thinkers in American history, is about the value of listening across differences. If, on hearing these ideas, you disagree, I promise I'll listen. And still better, this could be the basis for our discussion toward the end. So now I turn to my first section, the troubling uncertainties themselves and the way they became resources for James, starting with James himself, and then I'm going to go out into society. He was born in 1842. He grew up with people who personally experienced the founding of the American Republic, and he lived to 1910, witnessing the emergence of modernism. His grandfather, the original American William James, was an Irish immigrant who became a wealthy upstate New York businessman. One of his ventures, for example, was the Erie Canal. The parents of the better-known William James, in some ways, inverted traditional gender roles. Henry James, his father, was a self-described unreverend with intense religious interests who wrote spiritually oriented philosophy and was often his children's own teacher. Mary Welch James was very practical, the chief organizer of the household and of their many trips in Europe and in the US. William was the oldest of 5 children. Those others included Henry Jr., the great novelist, 2 other brothers who served in African-American regiments in the Civil War, and then started a farm for freed slaves after the war, and their only sister, Alice, whose insightful diary would make her a feminist icon. Not only did William's life span very different eras of American history, in addition, his education bridged very different outlooks, especially commitments to religion and to science. He grew up assuming the significance of the ontological window, as he put it, that his father provided with inspiration from the mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, to regard all natural facts as mere shadows of their spiritual substance, to borrow from the title of one of Henry Sr.'s own books. With these convictions for reducing material experiences to spiritual truth, he was eager for his eldest son to attend the new Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard University to help gain scientific legitimacy for his spiritual philosophy. William enrolled in 1861 with focus on chemistry before turning to anatomy and physiology in preparation for medical school. Yes, that's how this philosopher began his education. He was on his way to becoming a non-practicing physician, researching laboratory physiology to supply doctors with physical insights for improved therapies. That was a big thing in that era. This was the actual path of his friend, Henry Bowditch, who would become dean of the Harvard Medical School and founding president of the American Physiological Society. But for James, this scientific work brought tension with his religious education, as his father noticed when he was deep in his scientific studies, when the son was deep in his scientific studies. The father declared that the purely scientific cast of your thought is bringing a temporary blight upon your metaphysical wit. This shows the passion of the father's beliefs. And William felt torn by these contrasting views in religion and in science, and also by the kindred clashes of idealistic and empirical philosophies. He grew depressed by these uncertainties, especially with these troubled feelings amplified by health problems of his back, his eyes, and his digestion, and by his indecision about his career path, his relations with his family, and the prospect of ever finding a not impossible she, as he said in his hopes for marriage, which was long delayed. Without confidence or purpose, he even contemplated taking his own life. He rebounded, not by adopting any of the stark choices that troubled him, but by putting to use the contrasting positions themselves. In the first of his many methods for mediation across differences, he found that his interest in psychology could bridge his disparate vocational and intellectual influences. Of all departments of medicine, he said when still in medical school, he thought work with asylum patients for the mentally ill would be the most interesting, even as he added with dark humor that he himself might catch their contagion and go as mad as any of them. His serious point was that his work would allow his pursuit of science with physiology of body intersecting with mind. And this work would also tap the metaphysical impulses he had encountered at home and cultivated in the metaphysical club discussions he had with friends about the philosophical and religious implications of science. A major problem, however, was that there was no field of psychology and therefore no jobs. He himself helped to develop the new field. That's why he's called one of the founders. He expressed the process with some humor, saying late in life that the first lecture in psychology I ever heard was my own. Bowditch helped him get his first job teaching physiology in 1873. The next year, James added psychology, the first American course in the new field, with use of a small laboratory, also the first of its kind in the US. Rather than adopt the spiritual certainties of his father, or the confident reduction to material causation of many of his scientific peers, James opted for openness, based on his newfound commitment to integrating divergent views. To enable this stance, he declared to his diary in 1870, "My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." He did not part from or answer the ambivalence of his troubled times. Freedom turned his problem ambivalence into what I call his decisive ambivalence, enabling him to use diverse thoughts as resources for creative insights, together then deeper than the ideas available from any one side of the contrasts. And this takes me to section 2. Theories then serving as kind of like GPS, global positioning systems through the challenges. So what did he come up with? Throughout his work in many fields, James applied his freedom-inspired commitment to seeing the good things on both sides of the line, as he called his approach late in life. Here's a brief sampler. Here's a cliff notes of his whole career. So a sampler. He evaluated the influence of both body and mind in his psychology. He supported both the will to believe when facing genuine options for belief, but with circumstances more clear and less pressing, when belief wasn't as urgent, he endorsed criticism and caution before accepting beliefs. And when studying religion, he recognized the value and the respective shortcomings in both the optimistic religion of healthy-mindedness that he noticed in a large group of people, but another large group of sick souls, as he called them, who cannot so swiftly throw off the burden of the consciousness of evil. Two types of religion. Again, crossing differences. Our contemporary philosopher Charles Taylor, some of you may have heard of him, calls James our great philosopher of the cusp, meaning the borderlines or the edges between ways of thinking. And he credits him with this for his wide sympathy, Taylor talking to James, and his continuing ambivalence. Even as the decisive edge to his ambivalence included rating contrasting views for their respective merits. I'll focus on 3 of these ways James listens across differences. And here goes. This is the theory part of our program. One of James's first expressions of his interest, this particular interest, emerged while he was still teaching physiology and a year after receiving a contract to write a book in psychology. In 1879, he wrote The Sentiment of Rationality. How's that for a nice oxymoron? The Sentiment of Rationality. When still hounded by the uncertainties of his youth and feeling torn by the conflicting claims to authority of so many different systems. Bridging fields, true to his theme, he wrote a psychology of philosophizing to address the question, why do philosophers philosophize? Why do they even bother with that? Why all that effort to come up with worldviews? His response shows the impress of his own youthful journey. Even with all the complexities in the respective philosophies supporting religion or science, idealistic, empirical outlooks, theories of the dominance of mind or body, and more contrasting views, each way of thinking, he put it, begins with a strong feeling of ease or peace or rest in the basic assumptions of one side. The resulting feeling of sufficiency gives a feeling of sufficiency in those assumed thoughts of what he calls the sentiment of rationality. Those come from traditions, interests, feelings, aesthetic appetites that let us feel at home in a particular way of looking at the world. And from these felt foundations, people add great structures of rational understanding, for sure. He's not proposing that rationality is displaced by sentiments or reduced to them, but that they serve kind of like starting points for commitments. Recognizing the power of assumptions is a powerful first step for addressing different views. This theory offers a model for understanding the sources of difference in diverse assumptions and the need to reckon with and respect them before any mediating can ever emerge, can ever happen. So that's the first of the theories I'll talk about tonight. A second theory supporting a model for listening across differences emerges from James's ideas of attention. He was one of the first to pay attention to the power of attention as a mental gatekeeper. This sorting power is vital because the whole of experience is so abundant, even overwhelming, what he described as, for all of us, the great blooming, buzzing confusion of experience. Attention is kind of like a sorting hat, so to speak, of experience, enabling focus on particular parts of experience for particular purposes. He identifies this as a great human distinction. Other creatures observe and respond to experience, for sure. But humans select from experience to find patterns, remember the old, plan for the new, with purposes generating focus of attention and mental focus contributing to the purposes. This focalization of attention emerges from particular sentiments of rationality. In everyday life, we pay attention to one part, for example, of a room, like where you are, where any of us are right now at this moment, looking at this screen, rather than, let's say, for example, other small screens, perhaps. Every act of selection such as that involves overlooking of other parts of experience, those that do not interest our attention at that time. This illustrates how attention constantly generates centers of attention and peripheries of neglect. These same qualities of mind operate with broader thoughts too, not just everyday life. And that includes beliefs. And with every mind, a theater of simultaneous possibilities, as he put it. He likened attention to a sculptor working on a block of stone, creating a figure by strokes of choice, by choice, by choice. But diversity is ever present, since with other sculptors, other statues. In the same way, other experiences, other beliefs, other ideologies. Recognition that each position emerges from selective attention can encourage listening with empathy to alien outlooks of other people who are focused on other parts of experience. For positions held in relation to tangible portions of their diverse lived experience. And listening, by enabling consideration of other parts of experience, harbors potential to encourage interaction and change. Now, the accounts so far that I've presented include James developing a way of understanding different views, center of rationality, and how they emerge and how they operate with different attention. Then what? As my father would say to me as a child when I would complain about something or other in my, big little childhood world, Paul, you've analyzed the situation beautifully. Now, what are you going to do about it? Action was James's next step. My father, a tacit pragmatist. Who knew? He, that is James, contributed to the development of pragmatism as a method of settling disagreements. First, he laid out the appeal of different points of view. The resulting diversity produces a dilemma, because attempts to find final solutions result in interminable disputes. His alternative method was to assess for effectiveness in their respective practical consequences. He then observes that each committed belief offers windows into the complexities of experience, with all of them serving as instruments, not answers, not final answers at least, to enigmas, to mysteries. Such mysteries, challenges, and uncertainties aplenty in life, right? With each belief a potential resource, he added, and each also requiring deliberate scrutiny for addressing those challenges. Not that everyone gets a pass just because they thought it. Many have strong beliefs in particular outlooks, and they have been some of the strongest critics of pragmatism. The critics call it a form of relativism without the certainty of absolutes. James responds by welcoming the critics as part of the human array. Yes, that's part of it too. And recognizing the importance of feeling that every thought is absolute, as he said, recognizing their point of view, at the moment of conceiving it or of acting upon it. In addition, he also responds to this challenge with with an insight from religion compared to the divine, or compared to any final truth, each human position is partial. At best, a fragment of the mysterious whole. Pragmatic searches for effective truth are not relativistic defiance of absolute truth, but humble respect for its mysterious immensity. James maintains respect for each diverse assumption and each insight from selective attention, because with each attitude being a syllable in human nature's total message, it takes the whole of us to spell the meaning out completely. We need each other, he's saying. Some messages are clear, some distorted, and others may take a while to understand, but each is a clue in the messy world of human interaction. Now I turn to my third section, dealing with urgent problems, also known as putting these theories to work, with theories becoming models for action. James's openness to diverse views can make him seem optimistic. He did not claim such a positive view, but nor was he pessimistic. He saw reasons for both, as with his religious thought. Remember that reference to there's some that are healthy-minded, some with the consciousness of evil. True to his theories, he didn't take a side on optimism or pessimism. Instead, he called himself, with a newly coined word that I put up on the screen there, meliorism, based on his goal to improve or ameliorate the mixed conditions we all face. His deepest commitment was to honest reckoning with the negative and doing what we can, and suggesting what we can all do, to support the positive. This comes through in his fierce criticism of the lynching of African Americans in his day. This is a brutal topic. The explicit power in slave times of whites over blacks continued after legal emancipation in 1865. Whole communities would be intimidated, after all, with the public execution of black individuals perceived to have committed crimes, or even just to have achieved some success. If you take a look at that picture, that seems to be the message of the man on the right. See that? These murders brought a cruel distortion of democracy, with the people, in this case, white people in a community, acting outside the law to impose their mob verdict with no gathering or checking of facts, no legal counsel, and no trial by jury. Thousands were lynched, mostly in the South, but not only. At least 80% were African American from the end of Reconstruction in the late 1870s to the 1930s. A cruel and callous half century, including some destruction of whole towns and neighborhoods, such as Rosewood in my home state of Florida and in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district. During the peak periods of lynching at the turn of the century, and over 100 were killed every year by mobs, James expressed his outrage bluntly. He used the tools of his professorial trade to assess this blood orgy, he called it, identify its sources and the things stimulating it, and suggest ways to check the spread of this epidemic. To James, the criminals performing murder were not alien creatures wholly unlike the rest of us. They exhibit some of the many divergent aspects of humanity. Which aspects will people select? Sadly, his surrounding culture in his time was selectively attending to and amplifying some of the worst potentials in humanity. He recognized the aboriginal capacity for murderous excitement which lies sleeping even in the average civilizee. But the efforts of religion custom, law, education, and more generally enable peacefulness to endure. Their success, when it works, brings a triumph of our civilization. But the carnivore within remains, as he put it. After recognizing the power of these sentiments, he called for action. Protect these brutal feelings. At the moment of crime, he called for every police officer to do his utmost duty to maintain law and order. And they need support against retaliation, especially when opposing a threatening mob, as he put it. Then the courts, in the next step, need firm indictment and conviction of the mob leaders, those maniacal, real fanatics, up to and including with execution for their crimes. These actions address brutality already in place. James put still more emphasis on prevention. And for that, he lamented newspapers, the chief social media of his time, after all, that were doing just the opposite, effectively serving as culprits, spurring the crimes, with stories like making light of this dirty business, or even calling the murderers people who are doing a sort of justice, if, well, rather rude. The stories make the murderers seem excusable. Media influence held particular significance for those others in the lynching crowd, beyond those most intense, the many accomplices drawn into an irresponsible mob contagion. Apparently, some of the people on the left in this picture might fit that bill. Journalists effectively instruct them with a diabolical kind of education, bringing them to the mob, where they're then pushed into further drastic excitement. A dark side of the human capacity to respond creatively to the complexities of experience is sadly the attraction of novel atrocities. Journalism has helped to extend the awful epidemic, but, he added, with its power, with its reach, it can stop it. Rather than celebrate or condone the violence, papers should express horror and horrors. And with those acts of publicity, that way of publicizing, the news can support humanity's more benign potentials. Stern law enforcement and court proceedings will not stem the tide alone, but honest news reports can call out violence to encourage public support for ending it. Now I turn to the way James also applied his theories and his critique of racism in his protests against US colonial expansion. He was a leading member of the Anti-Imperialist League in opposition to the Spanish-American War, the Spanish-Cuban-American War, Spanish-Cuban-Philippine-American War, as an unprovoked series of aggressions. Opposition to Spanish control of islands in the Caribbean and the Philippines turned bluntly into military conquest. Emilio Aguinaldo, leader of Filipino indigenous national life, was actually allied with the US against the Spanish. But he was treated as a rebel against American control. Americans, James said, should blush with burning shame at the unspeakable meanness and ignominy of this trick. He expressed impatience with most Americans who did not agree with him because they were letting their sentiments, their war fever in this case, get out in front of their thinking. The results paralleled newspaper sentimentalizing of lynching, with awareness of Filipinos as mere matter in our way, as he put it, based on selective attention only in relation to our arrangements in this war. Americans treat the people on the receiving end of their power as if they have no feelings, no insides of their own. With experience vast, selective attention is crucial. The current choices surrounding him on American expansion were bringing colonizing condonement of America's ancient soul away from the nation's independence, born of being colonies themselves, freeing from an empire. Now, back in the US, I have my third example here. James also applied his theory about selective attention shaping different views to cultural issues, including debates in medicine. While he was trained in scientific medicine himself, he continued to practice alternative health care from his youth to his last days. When the mainstream doctors in his home state of Massachusetts proposed a medical registration act in 1894 that would bar the practice of non-mainstream healing practices, James objected. While he supported the impulse in the act for protection of the citizen against unprincipled and unskilled doctors, so he's always listening to both sides, even these he's disagreeing with, he maintained that the law would provide but an infinitesimal degree of security that it sought for protecting citizens. More important, this effort at protection was actually a way for mainstream doctors to use the power of the state to simply eliminate competition. Better, he insisted, to allow freedom of choice. The uncertainties about the alternative therapies, as charged by the scientific mainstream, also apply to the scientific mainstream, because the healing art is not such a definite thing, as he put it. This subject is elusive, and even the scientifically educated have disagreements and commit misjudgments and mistakes, only human. He called medicine a field with wisdom and impotence, great for its knowledge and its achievements, but with limitations compared to the enormous complexities of health and illness. Some non-mainstream practitioners make observations about these complexities, and they have produced, as he put it, facts, experiences, patent and startling. The crux of difference is that their experiences are not gathered scientifically in controlled experimental settings. They're experiences, but not experimental. And the regular profession stands firm in its belief that such experience is, in his words, worthless. That's what he's saying the mainstream says of them. For their part, those outside the mainstream return this disdain with more disdain. The law adds to this tendency then to polarize. It's already there, but the law is just promoting it even more. By contrast, James said each side would benefit if they would remain more humble and gather evidence from many sources to support the growth of a genuinely complete medical science. He's still using the word science there. He tapped his own scientific training to criticize the scientific mainstream, ironically, for not behaving scientifically. This was a version of a model he had laid out in his Will to Believe just a few years before, about the merits of seeking truth rather than retreating with caution because of the chance of error. Rather than risk loss of truth, in this case, from unorthodox experiences, he urged his fellow scientists to follow up on those facts from the non-mainstream, study them, interpret them. Rather than either or, the different approaches could complement each other. And not only for long-term inquiry, yes, for that, they could also serve as complementary approaches for any immediate medical case, with James applying his pragmatism in urging use of what worked most effectively. When he was developing that philosophy, 19th century healthcare was tacitly behaving in just these pragmatic ways. with competing medical systems and doctors enlisting what they called curopathy. Use what cures. Let that be my approach, said these doctors who were competing with each other. Or, as James himself said in 1869, when he was himself still in medical school, take the remedy as long as it heals. Because as with democracy in general, there should no more be an aristocracy of remedies than of physicians. James's readiness to apply his theories as models for addressing public issues did not mean that his views were always popular. Often, he, as speaker, was more popular than were his particular views. He responded to experiences of large and growing crowds at his presentations with surprise, saying in 1897, "Goodness, it looks as though I were popular." His views gathered respect even when not popular. He alienated many of his fellow doctors, with one of them even appalled that James allied himself with the enemies of scientific medicine. And they said still more deep criticisms of him. This reinforced his own point about polarization. Exhibit A from his critics. Also, James did not persuade majorities in his condemnation of lynching and colonizing aggression, sadly. But he put his moral stake in the ground, with his commentary serving as national conscience, a stance that may be immediately unsuccessful, as he said. However, he equated his approach to the work of soft rootlets of a tree or the capillary oozing of water. Those are not big forces, but they're capable of rending the hardest monuments of man's pride if you give them time. It takes a while sometimes. A long-term legacy of James's theories is that they provide practical tools for interactions with less conflict and with more coaxing of conflicts in constructive directions. This approach offers potential to deflate fighting impulses, even if it doesn't offer plans for complete resolutions. The news, like look up to our own time, the news reads like such a stream of terrible disasters, wouldn't you say? And I propose that, at least in part, that's generally because the news is presented and often heard in relation to ideal hopes that it's not living up to and constantly falling short of. That's politics as usual, with either or expectations. That's success achieved, or if not, despair. And this repeatedly. By contrast, the pre-political posture suggested here maintains full acknowledgement of the problems, but then it offers unblinking awareness of the assumptions shaping different commitments being contested, and ones you don't like, noticing that they are rooted in selective attention to different parts of experience, recognition that even the most vehement commitments, or even thorough ones, pale before the mysteries beyond all of us, deliberate searches for the most effective steps, get on board those trains, and active support of improvements, even small ones, as long as the steps remain active and not just for show. As with James's public stances, the prevention of conflict and learning across differences may not be as popular as showcasing repeated fighting. We seem to like fighting and stories of it. So I close with this comment about my own work now. The long-term goal of the essays and podcasts in the public classroom enterprise I'm starting as I retire to get to work is to provide stories and explanations about, as James would say, the validity of these possibilities. And there you have it. James inspired way to improve without absolute final answers. So
Thank you for that. Oh, sorry.
I turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Croce. That was really interesting. I don't know a ton about James prior to this, and I found that your talk to be fascinating. So I'm sure there are some questions out there. I have some of my own. We can get started with Laura Dominguez in the chat, who asked, given his views about American expansion, can we surmise that he opposed the U.S. government's treatment of Native American tribes and domestic expansion?
Yes, but he wasn't as vocal about that as he was about expansion beyond borders. And so that shows a shortcoming in his activism. And he was, after all, first an academic, and then he felt called to actions. He said a few things in objections to expansion across Native American territory, but that's a legitimate criticism that he didn't do more. And there are ways in which I and other people following James look at ways in which his ideas offer templates for a broadening that critique of how the United States of America handled its expansion west. And indeed, there are tremendous parallels to the kind of language he uses for American expansion abroad. That's a good question.
We've got another question from Julia Novakowski. Do you consider including on a certain blindness to bolster your thesis?
I do, and I only had an hour, so I blinked. Shall we say I blinked on that one? Not quite blind, but blinked. So I didn't include it, but I think on a certain blindness, written in his 1899 talks to teachers and to students on life's ideals, is a nice account that embodies a lot of these ideas and tips that I'm pulling from his theory pool in these models that I'm presenting here, because his idea of blindness is that the average person, no shade on people who just conduct themselves with the way the human average is, tend to be so focused, their selective attention again, on their own world and their own sense of importance and the purpose that they're engaged in, and they tend to be rather blind to the views of others. It's really an essay about empathy, and he ends this essay, as some of you may know, with less formal language. He just says, "Hands off." Hands off, like let people be. It's like you're going to run into differences, and realize that we all have our tendencies toward blindness about these differences, but just hands off. Show some empathy. Show some ways in which other people can be themselves, and it ain't going to ruin the world. And I mean, you do have to scrutinize for beliefs and ideas that are unsavory or worse. But each person has an impulse, a creative impulse, going back to his ideas about human creativity, has a creative impulse to come up with a whole range of different ways of being human. And this is this is a reminder, Julia's question is a reminder of my personal favorite way to define multiculturalism, that it's a way, this is kind of a James-inspired way to define multiculturalism, a term he didn't use, but it's kindred to his blindness idea, is that multiculturalism is a way for each person to say, oh, is that how another human being operates? And then for extra credit, maybe that other way of being human might give me ideas about my way of being. So I really appreciate that comment about on a certain blindness in human beings from 1899. It's a good one.
And I think that kind of segues then into another question of, I think most of us in attendance tonight would say that there's a lot of good ideas and a lot of good ideals in James' work. And you reference that he was more popular than his ideas at times. His ideas were respected, but not necessarily popular. How realistic do you see these ideas being in today's world.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. It's a frequent criticism. The realists, or in political science, they call them the advocates of the realpolitik, that you really have to acknowledge conflict and fighting. And I think it's important in my own point of view, but I see this in James too, so I feel a kinship with him on this, is that if you follow out realism beyond its sense that that is what is real in politics these days, but you just follow it to what are some of the implications of acting in those realistic ways of building up toward fighting, preparation for fighting, fights that bring destruction, fights that bring resentment and the opposition turning to want to fight back. How realistic is that? That brings a whole series of other problems. And so James is an advocate of what I call a practical idealism, that his ideas that seem ideal from the point of view of the realist is in many ways in the long term more realistic. Okay, so if there's an immediate issue, there may be an immediate reason for fighting, but wouldn't it be helpful, constructive, peace generating to try to figure out what are the sources of the fights to try to prevent it, rather than just constantly fighting with fighting?
An excellent point. Well, we've got a few more questions. One, did James's tendency towards depression abate once he developed these theories?
Abate's a good word because it never went away. One of his friends said to him, I always get the feeling that even when I have a pleasant interaction with him, it's almost as if he was stepping out of something darker and going back into it once I left. That he had a kind of darkness that continued with him. And I perceived that came from his constant sense of uncertainties. He dealt with depression about indecision and ambivalence by drawing on the differences, but that left him constantly alert to possibilities that some other point of view might be an improvement on the point of view he had, and vice versa, which is why his favorite phrase, if you had really good eyes, you can see it in one of the first screenshots, the first slides, the portrait of James at the end of his life. One of his favorite phrases is depicted there by his painter in 1903, ever not quite. There's always a kind of longing in him, in James, for something more, something ever not quite. So his painter showed him holding a book as if the book was the symbolic representation of his life work, and the painter chose the title of that book, Ever Not Quite. And that's the way he remained toward the end of his life. So yeah, it's a good question about his depression, and he didn't. So I guess a last word on that would be like a word from medicine, that it's more like he went into remission rather than cure. He dealt with it, but he also rated it for its uses.
Yeah, it seems that way. I don't think he could have been who he was without some amount of that, it seems like.
Yeah, and that also ties in with his sense of sympathy with traditionalist approaches to religion. He was on the liberal side. A lot of these positions that I'm referring to today show him being liberal on race, liberal on expansion, etc. But conservatives have a friend in court in this liberal, because it's not that he was a conservative, but he was so keenly aware of how those people thought. He said, for example, about conservative religious traditions, you can't talk those people out of their pessimism and their sense of the evils of life and the need, the craving need for salvation that brings, they need it too much. And I find in him then a good guide for understanding differences, because even though he had his own points of view, he was clear. I mean, I trust it's clear that, on these issues, he was very clear in his opposition to racism and expansion and professionalism, as he said, expanding too far. But he was constantly looking to listen even to those he disagreed with.
All right, so we've got two more questions. I'd love if we could get to them. So the first is, James basically called on police to do their duty despite probable criticism. Individual and groups of police have been recently criticized for supporting the dominant paradigm instead of following the law and those who need protection. What if police perceives themselves as righteous?
As righteous. Yeah. So I don't know if this was intentional in the questioner, but was the perceived implication that James was asking the police to be righteous against the criminal lynchers? I guess that seems reasonable to call that righteous, but I would prefer to call it, and I think this is in the spirit of what James was getting at, that he wasn't so much bringing a righteousness, but just police, do your job. Like if a mob is gathering to pull a suspect out of jail and take them out of court, prevent a court hearing and just kill them on the street or from a local tree, stop that. I guess there's this kind of righteous element to that, but it's also just like, that's your job. Stop that. So maybe another piece of this question is about recent issues, about ways to how can police handle criminality? How can police handle the abuse of their power? And I think he would be all on board with emphases on prevention, because that's what he emphasized in his own time. And I think he would emphasize things like the more prevention of crimes and of people being tempted toward crimes, the more social programs to help those people to divert from crimes, then their human creativity. And make no mistake, even people who turn toward crime are engaging in creativity. That's their creative act. They're trying to figure out something. Like, divert that creativity into something more constructive before we get to the criminality that happens. So I think he'd be on board with preventive measures. That's my hunch, although he's not living now, so I can't ask him.
No. All right, then the final question: how might James consider how we today can act and talk across differences, considering that there is becoming a splintered democracy where one side seems to want to vote to dismantle it? So how do we help support, educate when the news is designed to inspire hate, anger, tribalism? How can meliorism disrupt this dangerous time in American history?
Yeah. Well, one of the points I would draw on would be something I mentioned there in passing about ways in which a difficulty of achieving the goal that the question was asking about. One of the things that makes this difficult is an expectation that there's going to be a solution, and that we're going to get to a more peaceable relationship between the parties and the candidates and the constituencies. And that's precisely the point of his meliorism. After all, it only means, the simple way to put that is just improve. So if you notice the difference between improvement and solutions, improvements give you toeholds toward getting better. And there are lots of ways to do that. There are lots of fine organizations. I can think of some right now. There's Braver Angels. There's I've got my computer remembers better than I do. All these different organizations that are encouraging people to listen across differences. Smart Politics is another one. So those are toeholds. Now, it ain't the whole enchilada of solving polarization. But there's such a long train into this problem, it's going to take a while to get out. And the more toeholds, the better. And some here are going to draw on healthcare practitioners here who like to say that for chronic problems, for every year in, expect at least a month out. In other words, it's not going to be instant. So we've been dealing with the issues of our politics of polarization. They've become chronic because we've blurred the lines between politics and entertainment, because of the way our social platforms lend themselves to brevity of expression with fewer explanations, so that it's easier to say gotcha points, or what I see in my students, it's either awesome or it sucks. Excuse the language. But we've set up so much either or thinking that it's sometimes difficult to appreciate the toeholds that may help us step out of these politics that we're in now. Now, I realize that that means, oh, the improvement isn't going to be instant. But it's taken so long to get to this problem. We've got to do things that will help us get better. And better is better than an ideal that's impossible to reach that leads to people despairing. And that's what I see as the biggest problem now with polarization. It isn't that it's so much that we're differing. We're human. We're going to be different. It's going to happen. The biggest polarization is the way people are despairing. That's the end game. That's all we've got. But if you can take small steps, and that's what meliorism means. If you take small steps, you can begin to step out of it. And I realize there are enormous challenges with this. And right from the start, I wasn't presenting that I have the final solution to this issue, to these issues that I presented on, to the issue of the questioner there. But I think absolute solutions are part of the problem.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for this, Dr. Croce. This has been a really, really interesting discussion. How can everyone here stay in touch with you? Where can we follow what you're up to now that you've retired and started your real work? Where can we find you?
Right. Well, on the first screen, I'll just pop it up there. If I can get up here, Zoom. There's a link to, if you can see it. Yeah, I think it's working, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a link to my public classroom page, and these are some ways to contact me by email or text. If you text, I can even call back.
And we'll make sure that this goes out in the follow-up email with the recording as well for everyone who'd like to have an easy way to access it.
And by the way, dear audience, I did put together an outline that can be kind of a walkaway point, which will be getting to your inbox probably by tomorrow, which repeats this information and also provides a one-page summary of the bullet points of what I talked about tonight.
Which was super interesting. Well, thank you again, Dr. Croce. Everyone, you're welcome to check out the Library Company website, librarycompany.org, for the rest of see what else is coming up in the Fireside Chat series. We hope to see all of you in the future, including you, Dr. Croce.
That sounds good. I noticed the next one's on July 11th. I marked my calendar.
Yes, normally they're on the third Thursday. There's a conflict, so that one is a little bit earlier. So
you renegades. Okay.
yes, we're getting really going wild with it. So, all right, everyone, we'll have a good evening, and we'll see you all next time.